This is the long overdue patron only video that I've promised to do monthly. That means I'm really late. My apologies. Today, in an effort to catch up, I'll present two book reviews in one video. The first is Vatican by Father Malachi Martin, and the second is Star-Spangled Crown by Sir Charles Colomb. Two very different books on two very different topics, and I hope you find this interesting, or even helpful, in finding things to read that are good books that are free of degeneracy and free of the celebration of sin that characterizes so much of what's published today. And again, this is only for you. This will not be going up to the general public, for the general public on YouTube. Anyway, let's dive into this. Once I figure out the new live streaming system, by the way, that YouTube has set up, I'll be back to doing that as well. They really, really complicated it. You basically have to daisy chain a bunch of websites together, and it's really dumb. Anyway, let's get into this. Our first book to review is Vatican by Father Malachi Martin. It covers a lot of history of the church and puts a lot of events that we see in the news still today in their context, focusing on the Second Vatican Council, which is a divisive subject for Catholics, to put it mildly. Martin was present at the council, a fact that both his fans celebrate and his detractors use against him, for a variety of reasons. Either way, his experience there is important when understanding this book. As for the council itself, Catholics today are often divided into three camps about the Second Vatican Council. First, the majority know nothing about it aside from what they hear at Mass and accept it without question. The second have read a lot about the council and love it and everything it stands for. The third group reject the council, its novelties, and the problems that ensued from the council. I'm sure at this point you can think of people who take a more nuanced view of things, but they, in the end, fall into one of the other camps as well. What's often missing is an accessible history of the conciliar period of the Catholic Church. People often cite Wittgen's The Rhine Flows into the Tiber as a good source of history on the council and on the spirit of Vatican II that emerged from it. But it is far from being accessible to the typical reader. Malachi Martin's Vatican is accessible and is required reading for anyone to make sense out of the crisis in the Church, as it has existed for at least 60 years, or probably longer. I'd go so far as to suggest that you should treat Vatican as a companion piece to Dr. Taylor Marshall's Infiltration, as the two are more complementary than you might think. The novel connects the dots between the founding of the Vatican Bank, the hijacking of the council by radical modernists, to the assassination of John Paul I, as he is characterized in the book, and the rise of John Paul II to the papacy. Written in the 1980s, Martin did not foresee the nearly 30-year papacy of John Paul II and predicts that pope's death in the 1980s. Beyond that, I won't say anything about John Paul II because the death of that pope in the novel is critical to the climax of the story, and that part is pure fiction, but it's very awesome. The role of communism is brought up in greater depth than we hear about from most commentators today, both in the way that cancer took hold among some in the church and as an external pressure in various parts of the world. Martin goes into a great bit of detail about this particular point and connects the dots in ways that others typically won't and really haven't in the recent explosion of alternative Catholic media figures, tracing out the origins of the crisis in the church. For those unfamiliar with the author, Malachi Martin was a well-connected insider in the Vatican until 1964, when he asked Paul VI to be secularized and released from his vows of poverty and obedience in order that he might earn a living as a writer. He often gets accused of having been laicized, which isn't true, or being an agent of B'nai B'rith, which is weird given that he outed that organization in his other novel, the more famous one, Windswept House, as being central to the plot to destroy civilization. He gets accused of adultery and other unsubstantiatable claims that can't be defended against, largely in my mind, due to his writing of two books, Windswept House and the Jesuits, the latter of which he decided to out the religious orders in general as being in the grips of modernism. Now, on that accusation of adultery, there are some who knew him who say that he did lead a very kind of wicked life early on, but it was his writing of his book on exorcisms, Hostage to the Devil, that really snapped him back into a life of faith and repentance. Either way, I don't really think the sins of his past, if he really did repent of them, should be used against him to detract from what he says, because, frankly, most of what he says in these books is pretty accurate. Vatican is a novel that I highly recommend. It's way overlooked in his library. It is a political thriller in that it is full of Vatican politics. The main character can be understood as a sort of a caricature of Martin himself written into the novel, and he answers some questions people have had about him regarding what he would do if he were in a position to do something about the crisis in the church. In my video, The State of the Church According to Malachi Martin, I reveal a bit of the plot that I won't mention here, but I'll say this. It involves the Lodge, and Martin in this novel reveals the extent of the corruption of the Lodge and the Church in ways most of us don't realize or could even comprehend. Martin's writing style was called faction, a sort of blending of fiction and nonfiction. Fact and fiction, or faction. He said that Vatican was 85 to 90% true, leaving most of the side plot details of the main character and his origin as the fiction, though even that is based in reality. The facts of the book are easily discernible and can be easily fact-checked as long as you can get past his naming of his renaming of historical figures. In the novel, figures like Cardinal Ratzinger, Archbishop Lefebvre, Pope John Paul II, and others make appearances, though under slightly modified version of their given names. One thing to note, he calls the popes by the title Pope and then their fictionalized birth name. So his John Paul II is Pope Wojtyla, except Pope Wojtyla is replaced by the fake but obvious name he gave to John Paul II. I give this novel a solid 90% grade. It earned a higher grade, but it really does dive into details about corruption and politics that some may find a bit dry. Otherwise, I do think it is a highly recommended novel if you want to put the pieces of the history of the Church going back more than a century together into one place. But again, if I say anything more about what happened in that book prior to the founding of the Vatican Bank, that will be giving too many details away. Again, I don't want to ruin this book for you. The second book is very different. It's much lighter. It's a different kind of faction, if you want to call it that, by Sir Charles Colomb, the great Catholic historian. The book is Star-Spangled Crown, and it uses the fictional tale about the coming collapse of the United States that many believe to be coming right around the corner to tell the history of Catholic monarchy and the United States' roots in monarchy. Colomb is a monarchist and believes that things were in general objectively better before the revolutions of the 18th century. It's kind of hard to argue against, honestly, except for the technological aspect of the modern world, and technology isn't something monarchists are opposed to anyway. The story is told from the perspective of Charles Colomb's as-yet-to-be-born nephew by the same name, conveniently. In that work, the young Colomb, who is actually elderly at the time of the writing of the book, is recounting the collapse of the United States Republic and how it kicked off the collapse of the republics of the West and the reinstitution of monarchies across the West. At that time, the U.S. government had experienced a sort of accidental military coup that is extremely humorous, after a sitting U.S. president lost her mind in the Oval Office. After a few years of running the country as a dictatorship, the military figures couldn't really figure a way out of the mess they were in, and, in the end, invited a noble with familial ties and claims to the United States territories to be the first monarch of the United States. And that figure required Congress to accept him, which he did. That's how bad things were in the book. It's an unlikely tale, but interesting in that we get a different take on the history of the West than we typically get, which is filtered through the Protestantism of our historians and the atheists that they gave birth to. To quote the author, quote, "Star-Spangled Crown is not a call for radical change. It is an invitation for serious thought about the realities of civil life that we as a people have spent more than 2 centuries ignoring or avoiding at our ultimate peril. What values shall our society express? Who makes those decisions? By what right do they do so? What is America really? Or as our 22nd century author might say, what are the United States? Star-Spangled Crown offers one set of answers from a possible future, but above all, it calls on you to ask the questions in the present." And that's the point of the novel. If you've ever listened to the Tumblr House podcast, and if you haven't, you really should. It's probably one of the best Catholic long-form podcasts online, where Charles Colomb can be found every week. And by now you've heard that he isn't exactly optimistic about the immediate future for the Western countries, and especially for the United States. And that's not an insight into his partisan feelings, so much as it is based on his observation that the U.S. is fracturing as a people. This plays a key role in the story he tells. I highly recommend Star-Spangled Crown. It's short and an easy read, but it also gives an interesting take on the state of the U.S., but also provides a glimpse of hope for the Catholic Church. And that's all I'll say about the state of the Church as it's portrayed in the novel, because the Catholic Church is essential in that work. Anyway, I hope to do one of these every month. To give you a hint, I just finished one book on the Benedict XVI question, which I have never touched publicly on my channel and probably won't. And I'm reading another now that is directly related to it and to the state of the present crisis in the Church. My plan will be to get those books reviewed by the end of November. Anyway, thank you for your support. It is greatly appreciated. God bless.